World of Warcraft Classic is bringing back that authentic vanilla experience that warms our hearts with nostalgia and will undoubtedly absorb all of our free time once again. However, it's been nearly 15 years since the game first released, and the lore of Warcraft has been heavily expanded upon since then. So, taking into account what we know today, I'm going to cram everything that you need to know into one video. Everything begins with a group of cosmic beings called the Pantheon, which roamed the universe, bringing life and order to countless worlds. The champion of the Pantheon was named Sargeras, and his role was to battle and imprison the chaotic demons who sought to undo the Pantheon's work, which he did with ease, until he eventually came upon a world infected with parasitic creatures known as the Old Gods. These monstrosities were the creation of the cruel and merciless Void Lords, who planned to use the Old Gods to corrupt world souls and create creatures so powerful that the Pantheon would be unable to stand against them. Sargeras chose to destroy the world he had found, believing it already corrupted, but when the rest of the Pantheon chastised him for his rash action, he stormed off and began to meditate on the fate of the universe. Fear, doubt and despair overwhelmed him, and eventually he reached the conclusion that the only way to spare the universe itself was to wipe out all life within it. So he freed his captured demons, turning them into an army known as the Burning Legion, and also transformed himself into a horrific being of blistering hatred. Sargeras began to undo the work of the Pantheon, bringing chaos where they had once brought order. However, the Pantheon continued on their mission, steadily moving from one world to the next, until eventually coming across a planet called Azeroth. Azeroth was in complete chaos. A group of old gods were corrupting the world and enslaving the elements themselves. However, this world was special. Azeroth's soul had the potential to one day become incredibly powerful, so the Pantheon went to war with the Old Gods and the Elemental Lords, before eventually banishing the Lords to the Elemental Plane. However, the Old Gods could not be as easily removed, and were instead imprisoned deep within Azeroth itself. With their mission seemingly complete, the Pantheon moved on, and life began to take root on Azeroth. Sometime later, the Pantheon met with Sargeras and pleaded with him to abandon his cause, telling him about Azeroth's world soul and how it would one day have the power to challenge the Void Lords and undo their plans. However, Sargeras was unmoved, and he and the Burning Legion attacked and defeated the Pantheon, before setting out to find Azeroth, which Sargeras saw not as a saviour, but instead as a threat if it were ever to be corrupted. Millennia later, back on Azeroth, life has taken on many forms, and the Highborn of the Night Elves have begun to harness power from a magical lake known as the Well of Eternity. This drew the attention of Sargeras' Burning Legion, and the War of the Ancients broke out, as the Night Elves and the various people of Azeroth tried to defend their home. Eventually, the Burning Legion's invasion was defeated, however Sargeras himself was now attempting to pass through a portal within the Well of Eternity, and unleash his wrath upon Azeroth. Those resisting the invasion closed the portal, but by doing so, the well became unstable and imploded upon itself, shattering the lands into various continents, and the Azeroth that we know today was formed. Now we need to briefly visit another planet known as Argus, which was home to a powerful race of people called the Eridar. During Sargeras' quest, he had found them and began to corrupt their leaders to bring them into his Burning Legion, but one of them, called Velen, learned of Sargeras' true nature, and he and many of his people fled the planet. However, Kil'jaeden, another of the leaders, gave chase and pursued Velen and his people for years, moving from one planet to the next, before eventually they landed on a world called Draenor. Draenor was already home to other races, including the Orcs. However, they were a peaceful people and lived happily alongside the exiled Eridar. This was until Kil'jaeden arrived and began manipulating the Orcs, granting them dark magics and convincing them that the exiles were their enemy. The Orcs began to fight for the Legion, before eventually, under the leadership of Gul'dan, they drank the blood of a demon lord and became bound to the Burning Legion entirely, before slaughtering the remaining exiles. Velen actually managed to escape in secret, along with a small number of his people. However, Kil'jaeden believed that his work was done, and he abandoned the rampaging Orcs to their fate. Back on Azeroth, Sargeras was trying a new tactic, and had possessed the body of a human mage called Medivh. He contacted Gul'dan and the Orcs on Draenor, who had been driven into a mad bloodlust thanks to the demon blood. They were on the verge of destroying themselves when Sargeras told them about Azeroth, a world where there are plenty of other people for them to fight instead. Sargeras, through the possessed Medivh, worked with Gul'dan to open a portal between the two worlds and brought the Orcs to Azeroth. Eventually, the real Medivh, trapped inside his own body, managed to manipulate events enough to have himself killed and Sargeras forced out, but his work was already done and war was inevitable. This war essentially begins the story of the original Warcraft RTS games. However, a lot of the specific elements have been retconned in later games and literature, but the main thing to know is that the humans initially lost and were forced to flee across the sea to Lordaeron. There the humans formed an alliance with the dwarves, high elves and gnomes. However, the orcs continued to chase them across the sea, but now this newly formed alliance was able to withstand their might and eventually force them back through the dark portal to Draenor. The alliance destroyed the portal, but the connection between the two worlds was far too strong and they remained linked together. The remaining orcs on Azeroth who surrendered were put into labour camps. However, the orcs that escaped now knew there were other worlds out there and began to set about creating other portals. Of course, the Alliance couldn't just let this happen and sent an expedition to Draenor to stop them. However, they were too late and the portals began to open across the planet, making the world itself unstable and causing it to tear apart. To stop the devastation from spreading back to Azeroth, the brave Alliance expedition to Draenor were forced to close the portal from that side and became lost. Back on Azeroth, a man named Adalus Blackmore found a young baby orc, who he named Thrall, lying on the ground surrounded by the bodies of his dead parents. Blackmore had big plans for Thrall. He wanted to turn the orc into a general who would lead the other orcs for him against the Alliance, allowing Blackmore to rule the world. He trained Thrall in combat, tactics and language. However, Blackmore was a cruel and nasty man, and one day, Thrall, having suffered enough, escaped with the help of his friend Taretha Foxton. Between these two people, Thrall had experienced both the cruelty and kindness of humanity firsthand. Thrall went to find the other orcs on Azeroth, who had been able to stay out of the Alliance's clutches, including Ogrim Doomhammer, the former war chief of the Horde, and together they began to liberate the other orcs who had been imprisoned in the camps. However, during one of these attacks, Doomhammer was killed, and with his dying breath, named Thrall as the war chief of the Horde. Thrall continued to free the orcs, however, the kindness he had learned from Taretha stuck with him, and those who agreed to surrender were allowed to leave unharmed. Thrall reshaped the Horde into an honourable and mighty force. They claimed some land for themselves and began to reunite the remaining orcs on Azeroth. Sometime later, Thrall was awakened by a strange dream, which directed him to a prophet, who was actually the resurrected Medivh, trying to make up for what he had done while under Sargeras' control. Medivh told Thrall to take the orcs and travel to the distant land of Kalimdor, so, along with Grom Hellscream, they sailed off, in search of their destiny. Of course, while all this was going on, Sargeras and Kil'jaeden were still hard at work trying to find a way to destroy Azeroth, and as such, Kil'jaeden created a being known as the Lich King and sent him to the planet to weaken it in preparation for a new invasion. The Lich King was encased in ice, but his mind was free and he used his psychic powers to draw dark souls towards him, in particular a wizard named Kel'Thuzad. The Lich King's powers also created a plague, turning mortals nearby into undead servants, and eventually Kel'Thuzad unleashed this same plague upon the humans of Lordaeron, turning its citizens into the undead. Prince Arthas of Lordaeron went to investigate the plague, and together with the help of Jaina Proudmoore, they uncovered what was going on. However, they had very different views on how to deal with what was happening. Arthas killed Kel'Thuzad and then set out to destroy what he believed was the leader of the Undead Scourge, a dreadlord named Mal'Ganis, and after recovering a sword called Frostmourne, he was successful. However, it came at a cost, and the sword stole Arthas' soul and turned him into an ally of the undead. Jaina, on the other hand, was visited by the prophet Medivh, who told her to take anyone who would follow her west to Kalimdor, the same advice he had given to Thrall. Speaking of Thrall, he had made his way to Kalimdor, and along the way forged new alliances with the Darkspear Trolls and Tauren. Eventually, Jaina also arrived on Kalimdor, and along with Thrall was given a new message from Medivh. He warned them that the Burning Legion was once again preparing to invade Azeroth, and that to stop it, the orcs and humans would have to work together. In the meantime, the now undead Arthas was trying to resurrect Kel'Thuzad. Along the way, he turned the High Elf Ranger Sylvanas Windrunner into a Banshee, before eventually using the High Elf Sunwell to bring Kel'Thuzad back as a Lich. The remaining High Elves renamed themselves as the Blood Elves, in honour of those they had lost against the undead. Kel'Thuzad and Arthas now brought Archimonde to Azeroth. He was another of the leaders of the Eredar who had joined Sargeras long ago. Archimonde had been there in the War of the Ancients all those years ago, when the Night Elves thwarted the Burning Legion's invasion, so he set his sights on them and their world tree. He had also brought the Pit Lord Manoroth with him, the same Pit Lord who had given his blood to the Orcs back on Draenor, and once again he corrupted many of them, including Grom Hellscream, and brought them back under the control of the Burning Legion. Thankfully, Thrall, now allied with Jaina Proudmoore, was able to help Grom escape Manoroth's control, before Grom in turn sacrificed himself to free the rest of his people.
Thrall, the blood haze has lifted. The demon's fire has burnt out in my veins. I have freed myself.
However, Archimonde was still on the warpath and had made his way to Kalimdor, where the Night Elves, led by Tyrande Whisperwind, reawakened Malfurion and freed his twin brother Illidan. Malfurion had been instrumental in the War of the Ancients, but Illidan had been imprisoned by the Night Elves for his own actions during the war. However, Tyrande believed that he could be an asset in the coming battle. Malfurion very much disagreed, and Illidan went his own way to fight his own war against the Legion. The Night Elves joined forces with Jaina and Thrall, and together they made their move against Archimonde, and were able to bring him down. However, the destruction of such a powerful being came with a terrible cost, and to destroy him, the Night Elves also had to destroy their World Tree. The World Tree was the source of the Night Elves' immortality, and although it would eventually recover from the devastation, the immortality did not. However, Azeroth was now safe once again, and the Burning Legion's invasion was defeated. So with that, Medivh had done what he needed to do.
And now that my task is done, I will take my place amongst the legends of the past.
The Burning Legion's invasion was over, but many of those who orchestrated it remained at large. Kil'jaeden visited Illidan and offered him another chance to serve the Legion, telling him to seek out the Lich King and destroy him, as he had grown too powerful and was going to betray the Burning Legion. In exchange, he offered Illidan the promise of great power, and after using some magic to call upon allies like the Naga, he tried to destroy the Lich King. However, his brother Malfurion prevented him from succeeding, as Illidan's plan would also have destroyed the land of Northrend, where the Lich King resided. However, the attack still had a reasonable impact, and the Lich King's powers began to spill out from him, so he ordered Arthas to return to him at once, so they could merge together. However, at the same time, Arthas' powers were also fading, and he lost control of many of the undead forces, including Sylvanas Windrunner. Sylvanas still had a burning hatred for Arthas for what he had done to her, so she hunted him down. However, before she could kill him, Kel'Thuzad arrived and saved Arthas. The other undead who were also able to break away from the Lich King's control became known as the Forsaken, and Sylvanas became their queen, which in turn caused a civil war between the undead before the Forsaken eventually took control of Lordaeron. In the meantime, Arthas was still rushing back to his master, but before he could get there, he came face to face with Illidan, and the two of them battled in single combat. Eventually, Arthas defeated Illidan, and it was assumed that he had been killed, as Arthas then ascended the Frozen Throne and became one with the Lich King. However, Illidan was actually saved from death by his allies, who helped him escape to the destroyed remnants of the original Orc homeworld of Draenor, now known as Outland. As for Thrall and Jaina, they built their two cities, Theramore and Orgrimmar, and maintained the peace between their people. However, other human forces began to plague the Orcs, and a champion of the Horde named Rexxar confronted Jaina about it, but it was not her doing. In fact, it was Jaina's father who had been behind the attacks, and although she pleaded with him to stop, he would have none of it, and his forces eventually clashed with Thrall's. Jaina stood back and let the Horde kill her father, knowing that what he was doing was wrong, and through this action she was able to keep peace between her people and the Horde. This brings us up to about 4 years before the start of World of Warcraft, but as the opening cinematic will tell you, the pact between the Alliance and Horde that saw them defeat the Burning Legion has all but evaporated, and the drums of war thunder once again. In those 4 years, a number of events have taken place, such as the Forsaken joining the Horde, uniting with the Orcs, Trolls and Tauren. On the Alliance side, the humans had rebuilt the city of Stormwind that was destroyed by the Orcs during the First War, and they also formed a new alliance with the Dwarves, Gnomes and Night Elves. You are now up to speed on everything you need to know to understand what's going on in World of Warcraft Classic. But now for the big question, are you for the Alliance or for the Horde? As always, I've been James for Fandom, thank you for watching, and enjoy the game.